Hi, my name is Macy Wertman, and I will be doing my thing on A Clever Woman and a Doubt by Mary Elizabeth Coleridge. So, who was Mary Elizabeth Coleridge? She was an English poet, novelist, and essayist known for her poetry and her exploration of themes such as intellectual isolation, doubt, and emotional complexity. She might have been not as well known because she was a woman and that's how society was. But yeah. So, her birth and family, she was born on September 20th, 1861, into a very smart family. She had some very famous family members, one being Samuel Taylor, which some might know as a famous poet, who was her grandfather, by the way. Like, she was the granddaughter of that person. Her family background exposed her to literary influences early on. It also came with high expectations. So, her education in life, like I said, she was educated, but she was educated privately and interested in literature, philosophy, and poetry. Much of her life was filled with personal struggles such as health issues and a sense of emotional isolation, which later on we'll see in her stories. She was never married, which was kind of weird because she was so educated, and most men in society would go for a higher educated person because it means that they just were, classy, and it was what men were looking for. Her career and her work, she published poems, short stories, and essays. She wrote in what is called a periodical. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's what is a newspaper or a journal or an article or like a gazette or something like that. She's well known for her poetry, which combines with vivid imagery and deep psychological emotional insight. She was also a social critic addressing societal issues like a role of women and how the challenges of intellectual and emotional fulfillment. Um, so the historical and literary context. So this was during the Victorian era, which awesome, by the way. Her work was written during the late Victorian period, a time when British society was struggling with complicated social, cultural, and intellectual challenges. Most of the issues were like gender roles and intellectualism and independence. And if you don't know what intellectualism, it means like education, learning, things like that. So feminism and women's roles during this time, her work specifically displayed how these roles were limited and how there wasn't much available to women. Her poems often address the intellectual and emotional isolation of women, who, like herself, also felt those things. But yes, so, moving on now to the poems that I've chosen, starting with A Clever Woman. So, the context of this is that it was displays the experience of women who have intellectual abilities, like herself, find themselves constrained by societal norms, which would normally dismiss or undervalue their talents in any way. So, anything that a woman could offer, they were just automatically like, nope, not gonna have that. The poem's observations reflects Coleridge's own struggles as an educated woman in society that often limited women's roles. So, moving on now to the second poem I chose, which was Doubt. This explores the shared experience by humans of uncertainty and the emotional disturbance that doubt can create. It resonates with Coleridge's own introspective nature and her understanding of her difficulties. She navigated this through, I feel like, her own self-identity and knowledge that she had, and also like her own beliefs throughout this entire thing. So, moving back to A Clever Woman, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about which is which. So, this poem was a lyric poem. It was reflective, gloomy, self-analyzing. It had intellectual isolation, gender roles, emotional loneliness, societal expectations towards the end of. This was written towards the end of Coleridge's life. The form it was written was like a free verse, meaning that there was no like really consistency with anything of how it was written, like with rhyming or how many lines were in each stanza or anything like that. So there were a lot of metaphors that were used during this. I'll just name off one for time's sake. quote, "She is like a bird in a cage," end quote. The bird in a cage metaphor is central to the poem. It represents the clever woman who is intellectually gifted but confined by societal expectations and norms, which is something that she felt, the author felt. The bird, often associated with freedom, contrasts sharply with the cage, which represents restriction, entrapment, and lack of agency. The metaphor illustrates how women's intellectual abilities do not bring her the freedom or respect she deserves, but rather leave her feeling trapped in a world that fails to recognize or value her talents. Now moving on to imagery. So one that I found was again with the cage. So it was, quote, "A bird in a cage," end quote, quote, "The bars are fine to the touch," end quote. So I believe that the author uses visual imagery here to create a clear image of confinement. The bird in the cage is a powerful image, evoking a sense of restriction and longing. The bars of the cage are described as a, quote, "fine to the touch," end quote, which further emphasizes the idea that the woman's talents are refined and highly developed, but they are still trapped by societal norms. The fine bars are a reminder that intellectual abilities, while valued, are not enough to free the women from a social limitations. I believe that I had seen that there's a lot of repetition through this. The poem uses the woman's cleverness as a symbol, and then the use of vivid and expressive language creates a sense of gloomy and regret and emphasizes the woman's longing for love. But yes, I feel like that was all shown throughout the poem, which I believe was very well, shown through the words, and especially the quotes that I chose. So the summary of this, the speaker in the poem describes the clever woman as someone who has intelligence and a quick mind, but she is lonely and misunderstood. The clever woman is not admired or celebrated by society. Instead, she finds herself, feeling lonely and contained, like that bird that she was talking about. She always feels isolated by her intellectuality. So it was either she was internally isolated, and it was also like the society forcing that on her. She had a lot of limitations, like society wouldn't allow them to do things, and that just brought like a lot of loneliness. Now moving on to Doubt. So this was lyric poetry. The tone was somber, philosophical, and thoughtful. Some themes that were hit were uncertainty, existential doubt, internal conflict, and then also the search for meaning. So some things were used, like simple language. Despite the depth of the theme, the poem uses relatively straightforward language, allowing the reader to easily access the speaker's thoughts and feelings. There's also some metaphorical imagery. I feel like these represent the abstract concept of doubt, often drawing from natural elements to create a sense of ambiguity. And then I feel like there was also like a flow that contributed to this and the quality of the speaker's internal dialogue. And then lastly, I felt like that the poem was written from a very personal perspective, directly addressing the readers with a sense of confiding in them about the speaker's doubts. So the summary for this poem was: the speaker in the poem describes doubts as a powerful, unsettling force that prevents clarity or peace of mind, a sense of being trapped in a state of indecisiveness and inability to find solid ground, both intellectually and emotionally. The speaker begins to question not just the external world, but the inner sense of self and truth. It just brought, like, the whole thing is just about doubt and how this, just is taking over the author and how it's impossible to live with almost. So some major themes of both the poems is they both hit intellectual and emotional isolation. They both struggle with uncertainty. They both have social constraints and through like their gender or just intellectual, or it just feels like everyone is oppressing them. And then the emotional cost of intellectual and existential struggle is also shown through both of these poems. So the analysis of a clever woman, quote, "She is like a bird in a cage, not that the cage is made of gold, not that the bars are fine to the touch, but a cage is a cage and the freedom is gone," end quote. So my analysis in this is that in this passage, it uses visual imagery like the cage and the bird, and it uses symbolic imagery as well, which is, freedom. So they are just feeling so confined, and, that clever woman can't get away from all these restrictions and this loneliness and just the confinement that the society is putting her into. So the image of the bird in a cage is symbolizing how intellectual women during this time can't ever show their talents. They can't use what they've were given. They're pretty much imprisoned within this cage by societal expectations and norms. So the golden cage then, symbolizes how the women can't ever become free because they're trapped. But yeah. So now moving on to doubt. Quote, "And doubt is the cloud that hangs over the heart, so heavy and dark that it is hard to breathe or see through the fog that the mind creates," end quote. So this one, my analysis of it is just, it's very dark, it's very heavy. It uses all this imagery to build and describe this emotional and mental weight of doubt. The metaphor of doubt as a cloud that hangs over the heart invokes a sense of oppression and weight and suffocation. Oh, that word is so big, suffocation. Like this author literally feels suffocated. The cloud isn't just an obstacle to clarity, it is a heavy and dark, suggesting that doubt is not just a passing feeling, but a consuming and persistent force that clouds the speaker's emotional and mental state. Just the phrase, one more thing, quote, "hard to breathe or see," end quote, uses both like a tangible and visual imagery to show how doubt can just, be a destruction for any understanding or just the way that people are living within this world. And so then moving on to the fog that the mind creates is both a figurative and literal. The mind's uncertainty clouds clear thinking, leaving the speaker in a state of confusion and emotional just destruction. So yeah, I would just say that the whole analysis of this is that the author is feeling suffocation and that, her mind is making these things up, but it's only because of what society is pushing onto her. So connecting these two poems together with another poem that we've read this semester, the one I've chosen is Sylvia Plath's, and it's Mirror. And so the reason I chose this was because I feel like they all deal with emotional isolation and the struggle for identity. You can just see throughout all of them that they're all shaped by the internal conflicts and external society pressures. In the story Mirror, it takes on the theme of self-examination and the disillusionment that comes from confronting one's true reflection. I feel like it kind of goes together because even though they're written in different times, I feel like you can just see that society is expecting so much from them. But I feel like also through Mirror, in that self-reflection, it delves into the isolation that comes from confronting one's identity, particularly in the context of aging and societal expectations of beauty. And so now when looking at the other two poems, you can see that, the woman is intellectual and she does have this intelligence, but she's not able to use them. So she's, pushed into societal expectations just like this one person was when they were aging. And I feel like all three poems show so much imagery and, it uses so much of just poetic devices that we have learned this semester. And then I think that all three poems struggle to reconcile their inner selves with the world's expectations, leading them to feelings of isolation and dissatisfaction and, even in some cases, just despair. So that was my little spiel and my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys have any questions, please leave them down below. I'd love to answer them. I found this very entertaining and very interesting just to study, and I had so much more information, but I couldn't fit it in the time, and I'm already over time. So thank you guys for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed.